What does it mean to be a woman who cannot be bought? In a world where everything and everyone has a price, what is the value of a soul that refuses to be sold? This is not a story of queens or warriors, but of a quiet strength found in the most hopeless of places. It begins, as so many stories of quiet desperation do, in the heart of a city that has forgotten how to be kind. It begins in the Ethelberg Market Square, a place that smells of wilted spices, damp earth, and the faint, metallic scent of despair. Here the cobblestones are slick with grime and regret, and the air is thick with the cries of merchants selling wares as tired as their own spirits. It is a place of stark, cruel divides, where the wealthy glide through the filth in their polished boots, and the poor are just another part of the grimy backdrop, their faces blurred into a tapestry of collective suffering. Among this sea of forgotten faces is a young woman named Ilara. She is 20 years old, though the fear in her eyes makes her seem both younger and ancient at the same time. They are the eyes of a cornered animal, perpetually wide, always searching for an escape that does not exist. Her frame is so slight, she seems as if a strong gust of wind could carry her away, and her hands, delicate and small, are permanently stained with the faint green of stems and the bruised purple of petals. She sells flowers, or rather, the ghosts of flowers. Blooms that were vibrant just yesterday are now her only currency. Their drooping heads a perfect mirror of the city's spirit. She is practically invisible, a whisper of a person tucked into a corner of the square, her silence a shield against a world that has only ever been loud and violent. She has learned that to be unseen is to be safe, but safety, she is about to discover, is the most fragile illusion of all. Her world, built on a foundation of silence and invisibility, is about to be shattered. The chaotic symphony of the market suddenly falters, the noise dying down to a nervous murmur. The crowd, a moment ago a single jostling entity, parts like a receding tide. Through the newly formed canyon of people comes an obsidian black carriage, gleaming like a shard of night in the pale afternoon sun. It is pulled by two magnificent black horses, their hooves striking the cobblestones with a sound like judgment. This is the arrival of Lord Valerius, a man whose name is spoken in hushed, fearful tones throughout Ethelberg. He is a man whose arrogance is as finely tailored as the dark, immaculate clothes he wears, a man who moves as if the very ground he walks on is an inconvenience he must tolerate. The air grows cold around him, the desperation of the market replaced by a more refined, more chilling kind of cruelty. His gaze, the color of winter ice, sweeps over the crowd with a look of profound boredom and contempt. He is not looking at people, he is surveying property, assessing the worth of the lesser beings that scurry around him. His eyes pass over burly merchants and weary mothers, dismissing them all with an imperceptible sneer. And then they stop. They land on Ilara. In that single, terrifying moment, her shield of invisibility is torn away. She feels his gaze like a physical touch, a cold violation that travels from her skin to the very marrow of her bones. A cruel, knowing smirk plays on his lips. He doesn't see a person. He sees a curiosity, an unbroken thing he might enjoy shattering. He steps down from his carriage, his polished boots landing on the filthy stones with a soft, predatory thud. The last vestiges of sound in the market die away. There is only the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator that has found its prey. He does not walk to her. He glides, his presence a suffocating force. He stops a few feet from her small stall of dying flowers, but he does not speak to her. He speaks at her, his voice a booming declaration, meant for every soul in that square to hear, a pronouncement of ownership. "Sell her to me," he commands, his voice dripping with the casual authority of a man who has never been denied anything. He gestures with a flick of his wrist, not at a person, but at an object. "I need a wife." The words hang in the air, obscene and unbelievable. Before the shock can even register on the faces of the onlookers or in the frozen landscape of Ilara's mind, he performs the final act of degradation. He pulls a heavy purse of gold from his coat, the coins, clinking with a sound that is both a promise and a curse. He does not hand it to her. He tosses it onto the ground at her feet, where it lands with a dull, heavy thud in the mud and grime. It is a gesture of ultimate contempt, an act that says, "This is all you are worth, the price of you no more than the dirt you stand on." The world dissolves. For Ilara, the faces of the crowd become a blur of pity, fear, and a strange, morbid excitement. She sees their eyes, but no one moves. No one speaks up. They are as trapped as she is, bound by the same chains of power and poverty. Her breath catches in her throat, a tiny, sharp sound that no one can hear. Before she can think, before she can even process the violation, two of Valerius's guards step forward. Their hands are rough, their grip like iron. They seize her arms, pulling her from the fragile safety of her small corner. The scent of her own crushed flowers fills her nostrils, a funereal perfume for the death of her life as she knew it. Her feet leave the ground and a scream builds in her chest, a silent howling gale of terror and disbelief. But it never escapes. It remains trapped inside her, lost in the roar of a life stolen in a single brutal public moment. She is no longer a flower seller. She is an acquisition. And you, who are watching this story unfold, have you ever felt that? That moment when the world's judgment falls upon you like a physical weight, a verdict you never asked for, delivered by people who do not know the first thing about the contents of your soul. Have you ever been made to feel small, to feel worthless, by a power so much greater than your own, that to fight back seems not just futile, but insane? If you have ever felt the sting of being misjudged, of being seen as an object, of having your voice silenced before you even had a chance to speak, then you know a fraction of the cold dread that was flooding Ilara's heart. Leave a comment below and share that feeling, because the story of this young woman is a reminder that this kind of injustice, big or small, is a pain that connects us all. It is a poison that can only be fought when we realize we are not alone in our suffering. The guards drag her toward the obsidian carriage, her worn-out shoes scraping uselessly against the cobblestones. She catches a glimpse of the purse of gold, half buried in the mud, a glittering wound on the face of the earth. It is the price of her life, a sum she never agreed to, for a transaction in which she was not a participant but the product. The faces in the crowd are a gallery of human weakness. She sees a woman turn away, unable to watch. She sees a man shake his head with a look of sad resignation. She sees the hungry eyes of children who see only the gold, not the girl. Not one of them meets her gaze. To look into her eyes would be to acknowledge her humanity, and in the face of Lord Valerius's power, that is a risk no one in the Ethelberg market is willing to take. Her invisibility has returned, but it is a new, more horrifying kind. She is no longer unseen. She is unpersoned. Her mind, a place that has always been a quiet refuge, is now a storm of fragmented images and raw terror. She thinks of the small, damp room she calls home, the only place she has ever felt a sliver of peace. She thinks of the elderly woman who raised her, a woman who taught her the language of flowers, but could not teach her how to navigate the cruelty of men. She remembers the woman's last words to her, a whispered warning. "Be like the root, my child. Stay hidden, stay deep. The world will try to pull you out." And now she has been pulled out. She has been ripped from the earth, her roots exposed and severed, left to wither in the harsh, unforgiving light of a rich man's whim. The world is no longer a place of potential dangers to be avoided, but a confirmed nightmare from which there is no waking. As they reach the carriage, one of the guards shoves her forward. She stumbles, her knees hitting the hard edge of the carriage step. Lord Valerius is already inside, seated on the plush velvet cushions, looking at her with an expression of bored impatience, as if she were a piece of luggage that was taking too long to load. He does not offer a hand. He simply watches, his cold eyes cataloguing her torn dress, her stained hands, her terrified face. He is assessing his purchase. The smirk returns to his face, a look of smug satisfaction. He has bought himself a new toy, a wild little thing from the market that he can now take home to his cold, opulent fortress and break at his leisure. The door to the carriage is a dark, gaping mouth, promising to swallow her whole. Her life, as she knew it, a small and silent thing, was over. But what awaited her in the cold stone manor of the man who had just purchased her soul was a darkness she could never have imagined. As the guard forces her inside and the heavy door slams shut, plunging her into the dim, suffocating interior, the last thing she sees of the outside world is a single, crushed flower petal lying on the cobblestones where she once stood. It is a splash of faded purple against the grey, a final, fragile testament to the person she used to be. The carriage lurches forward, and with it Ilara is carried away from everything she has ever known, a captive on her way to a gilded cage. The sounds of the market fade, replaced by the rhythmic, relentless clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the stone. Each sound is a step further away from freedom, a beat in the funeral march of her old life. She sits opposite Lord Valerius, huddled in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. He says nothing. He simply watches her, his icy gaze a constant, unnerving pressure. The silence in the carriage is heavier, more terrifying than the noise of the market ever was. It is a silence filled with unspoken threats, with the chilling promise of what is to come. She is no longer Elara, the quiet girl who sold flowers. She is now a possession, an object defined only by the man who owns her. And as the carriage rolls on, deeper into the wealthy, stone-hearted districts of Ethelberg, a single terrifying question begins to form in the chaos of her mind. What happens to a person when they are sold? What becomes of a soul that has a price tag placed upon it? She does not know the answer, but she understands with a certainty that chills her to her core that she is about to find out. She was no longer a flower seller in the market. She was property, and her new life, a life she never chose, was about to begin in a cage made of gold and sorrow. The journey into the heart of her own despair had just begun. To truly understand the depth of the abyss into which Elara had been thrown, you must first understand the ground she came from. It was not solid ground. It was the thin, brittle crust of earth over a chasm of forgotten things. Her life did not begin with a cry, but with silence. She was a foundling, an unopened letter left on the cold stone steps of a forgotten temple on the city's edge, a place where the gods had long since stopped listening. She was taken in not by priests or acolytes, but by a single stooped woman named Lyra, the temple's last caretaker, whose own life was a study in endings. Lyra was a creature of dust and fading light, her hands as gnarled as ancient roots, and her voice as thin as a winter wind. She was all Elara ever knew of. Family, a fragile shield against a world that had discarded them both. Lyra's body was failing, a slow collapse of bone and breath, but her mind was a garden. It was she who taught Elara the language of flowers, a silent, secret dialect that became Elara's only true tongue. She learned that a marigold was a shield against grief, that a sprig of lavender was a prayer for peace, and that even the most common daisy held a story of resilience. This was her education. While other children learned letters and numbers, Elara learned the botany of hope. Lyra would hold up a wilting rose and say, "See, its beauty is not gone, it is just changing. It is becoming a memory." Through these lessons, Lyra gave Elara the world, but it was a world seen through the soft, forgiving filter of petals and leaves. She could not, or would not, teach Elara about the hardness of men, about the currency of cruelty that was traded far more freely in Ethelberg than any coin. This upbringing forged in Elara a soul that was profoundly gentle and devastatingly unprepared. Her silence was not a choice. It was her native language. Her shyness was not a trait. It was a cloak of invisibility she learned to weave around herself. In the brutal ecosystem of Ethelberg, to be noticed was to be consumed. She saw it every day in the market. She saw the way the city guards looked at the baker's young daughter, their eyes like hungry wolves. She saw the way a wealthy merchant would knock over a fruit seller's cart and walk on without a backward glance, the vibrant colors of the bruised fruit bleeding into the grime like a mortal wound. And so, Elara learned to be small. She learned to lower her eyes, to quiet her breath, to exist in the spaces between things, like the moss that grew in the cracks of the cobblestones. She became an expert in the art of not being there at all. Her one rebellion, the single flicker of a dream she dared to hold in the deepest, most hidden part of her heart, was a secret. She never spoke aloud, not even to Lyra. She dreamed of a room, not a grand room, not a chamber in a castle, but a small, simple space with a single large window that faced the morning sun. In this imaginary room, there was an easel, a set of paints and clean canvases. She dreamed of painting the flowers she sold, of capturing their fleeting, vibrant life before it faded. It was a desire not for wealth or for fame, but for permanence. In a life defined by loss and decay, she longed to create something that would last, to hold on to beauty with bristles and pigment, to prove that something fragile could be made eternal. This dream was her most precious and most dangerous possession, for in a world like hers, hope was a liability. Have you ever held a dream like that? A hope so private and so pure that to speak it aloud would feel like a betrayal, like exposing the softest part of yourself to a world full of sharp edges. It is the secret garden we tend to in our souls, the one place That is entirely our own. For Ilara, that garden was about to be paved over, bulldozed by the careless arrogance of a man who saw the world not as a place of hidden beauties, but as a catalogue of things to own. The purchase of her body was a violation, but the true horror was the theft of that quiet, sunlit room in her mind. It was the desecration of the one truly sacred space she had ever known. Lyra had died 2 winters ago, her passing as quiet as her life. She had faded, like a pressed flower, leaving Ilara utterly alone. The small room behind the temple became Ilara's whole world, a damp, cold space that smelled of earth and dying things. The meager coins she earned from her flowers were barely enough to buy bread, and the hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. But it was the loneliness that truly hollowed her out. The market, for all its cruelty, became her only community. She was not a part of it, but an observer on its fringe. She knew the other vendors by their habits. The loud, boastful butcher who was secretly kind to the stray dogs, the old woman who sold lace and whispered gossip like prayers, the young boy who stole apples with a magician's skill. They were a constellation of solitary stars, each trapped in their own orbit of poverty, close enough to see each other's light but too far to offer any real warmth. They saw her, of course, but they did not truly see her. To them, she was the flower girl, a sad, silent fixture in the corner of the square. Some pitied her, leaving a chipped cup of water for her flowers on hot days. Others were suspicious of her silence, mistaking her fear for arrogance. "Too quiet, that one," the lace seller would mutter. "Quiet ones are always hiding something." They did not know about the sunlit room in her mind. They did not know about the language of flowers. They saw only a weed growing in the cracks of their world, something to be ignored or, if it grew too much in the way, to be plucked out. This was the social fabric of her life, a threadbare blanket of indifference, woven with threads of pity and distrust. Her sense of worthlessness was not born in the moment Lord Valerius tossed that purse at her feet. It was merely confirmed. Her entire life had been a lesson in her own insignificance, an orphan, a charity case, a silent girl selling dying flowers in the dirt. She had internalized the world's judgment so completely that it had become the foundation of her identity. Lyra's final words to her had been a warning, a piece of loving but ultimately crippling advice. "Be like the root, my child. Stay hidden. Stay deep. The world will try to pull you out." Ilara had obeyed. She had lived her life underground, in the dark, believing that was where she belonged. Valerius's act of public purchase was the violent spade that had ripped her from the earth, exposing her pale, fragile roots to a sun she was not ready to face. He had not just claimed her body, he had validated her deepest, most soul-crushing fear, that she was nothing more than a thing to be dug up and discarded. The carriage continued its relentless journey, each turn of the wheels a new verse in a song of despair. It moved from the familiar grime of the lower districts to the clean, sterile grandeur of the upper city. Here the cobblestones were scrubbed, the buildings were tall and proud, and the air itself seemed thinner, colder. It was a different world, a planet away from the warm, suffocating press of the market. Ilara looked out the window, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the passing stone facades. She saw a girl with wide, terrified eyes and smudges of dirt on her cheek. She did not recognize herself. The person she was just an hour ago, the quiet flower seller with a secret dream, seemed like a character from a story someone else had told her. Lord Valerius had not spoken a single word to her during the entire journey. He simply sat, observing her with the detached curiosity of a collector examining a new specimen. His silence was a weapon, far more terrifying than any shouted threat. It communicated her complete and utter irrelevance. She was not worthy of conversation. She was cargo. Her thoughts, her fears, her entire inner world were of no more consequence to him than the thoughts of the horses pulling his carriage. This chilling realization began to settle in her bones, a cold deeper than the winter that had taken Lyra. The injustice was not just that she had been taken, but that she had been so effortlessly erased. The city of Ethelberg was built on a foundation of such erasures. It was a place of invisible walls and unspoken rules, a society where one's birth determined one's worth with the finality of a gravestone. The wealthy, like Valerius, moved through life as if it were a stage built for their performance, with the poor serving as the silent, faceless scenery. Justice was a commodity, bought and sold in the same markets where Ilara sold her flowers. She had always known this in an abstract, instinctual way, She had felt it in the gnawing hunger in her belly while the rich feasted, and she had seen it in the casual cruelty of the powerful. But to know a thing and to have it branded onto your soul are two very different experiences. She was no longer just a witness to the city's cruelty, she was its primary exhibit. As the carriage slowed, a monstrous shape began to resolve itself through the window. It was a manor, but that word was too soft, too gentle. It was a fortress of dark stone and sharp angles, a jagged tooth of a building set against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It seemed to absorb the light around it, radiating an aura of ancient, unyielding cold. There were no flowers in its manicured gardens, only perfectly symmetrical hedges and gravel paths that crunched like bones under the carriage wheels. This was to be her new home, her cage. The architecture itself was a statement of power, a declaration that everything within these walls, stone, wood, and flesh, belonged to the man who ruled it. The carriage came to a halt. The silence inside was suddenly absolute, a held breath before a scream. For the first time, Lord Valerius stirred. He did not look at her, but toward the heavy oak doors of the manor, which were already swinging open, spilling a cold, unwelcoming light onto the gravel. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man arriving home with a new prize, a trinket he was eager to show off and eventually to break. The guard opened the carriage door, and the cold night air rushed in, a shocking, unwelcome slap against Ilara's skin. It was the air of a different world, and she was now its unwilling immigrant. She had believed that the market was the cruelest place she would ever know, a place of daily struggle and quiet desperation. She had thought that the ache of loneliness in her small, damp room was the deepest sorrow she could feel. She was wrong. The pain she had known before was the pain of neglect, of being unseen. The pain that awaited her inside that stone fortress was of a different nature entirely. It was the pain of being seen too much, of being watched, studied, and slowly, deliberately dismantled. She had been a ghost in the city, but here she was to become a specimen. As the guard's rough hand grabbed her arm to pull her from the carriage, a final desperate thought flickered in her mind. It was a memory of Lyra, holding a small, resilient wildflower that had pushed its way through a crack in the temple stones. "Some things," Lyra had whispered, her voice full of a gentle awe, "refuse to believe they are in the wrong place." But as Ilara's worn-out shoe touched the cold, unforgiving gravel of the Valerius estate, she could not feel that resilience within herself. She felt only the crushing certainty that she was a flower planted in a garden of stone, a place where the sun was never meant to reach. What she did not know, what she could not possibly imagine, was that even in the deepest, most absolute darkness, a single hidden root can survive, waiting for a rain it does not yet believe will ever come. The heavy oak doors of the Valerius manor closed behind her, with a sound not of a latch clicking, but of a tomb being sealed. The chaotic, living noise of the city was instantly extinguished, replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, that Ilara could hear the blood pounding in her own ears. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the hollow, breathless silence of a place where life did not happen, but was merely preserved, like a butterfly pinned under glass. The air was cold, smelling faintly of lemon polish, and something else, something ancient and metallic, like old blood or forgotten secrets. Every surface gleamed with a cold, unforgiving light, polished marble floors that reflected her tattered form like a distorted, mocking pool, and dark wood walls that seemed to drink the very warmth from her skin. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum built to honor the god of wealth, and she was its newest unwilling sacrifice. A servant, with a face as blank and emotionless as the stone walls, led her up a grand, sweeping staircase, her own footsteps a clumsy, shameful shuffle against the oppressive quiet. She was taken to a room larger than any space she had ever occupied in her life. A massive four-poster bed draped in dark velvet dominated the center, and a fireplace of carved stone stood cold and empty. A single tall window, its panes latticed with iron, looked out not onto a garden, but onto a high stone wall. It was a room of breathtaking luxury and suffocating imprisonment. The servant deposited a pile of silk and lace garments on a chair, clothes so fine they seemed to hum with a life of their own, and left without a word, locking the door from the outside. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the final punctuation mark on the end of her freedom. She was alone, a ghost in a stranger's finery, in a cage made of gold. That night, Sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the old manor, every sigh of the wind against the iron-laced window was a new and specific terror. Sometime in the dead of night, the lock turned again. Ilara's heart seized in her chest as Lord Valerius entered, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He did not approach the bed. He stood by the cold fireplace, his presence filling the room with a chilling, predatory energy. He finally spoke, his voice a low, controlled murmur that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. He told her that her old life, the pathetic, grimy existence she had clung to, was over. She was now a project. He would have her scrubbed, polished, and taught. She would learn to walk, to speak, to eat, to think, as a Valerius bride should. He was not speaking to a person. He was outlining the specifications for a new acquisition. He was the sculptor, and she was the raw. Worthless clay he would mold into something acceptable, something worthy of bearing his name. The days that followed were a systematic dismantling of her soul. The civilizing began. Tutors were brought in, severe-faced men and women with eyes that held no pity, only judgment. A dance master forced her into postures that felt like breaking, his cane rapping sharply against her back when she slouched. A speech tutor tried to force the market slang from her tongue, making her repeat vowel sounds until her jaw ached, her own quiet voice feeling alien and clumsy in her mouth. Every lesson was a new humiliation, a fresh reminder of her own perceived inadequacy. They were not trying to educate her, they were trying to erase her. They chipped away at her mannerisms, her accent, her very way of being until she felt like a statue being violently carved, losing a piece of herself with every blow of the chisel. Have you ever been made to feel that the very essence of who you are is wrong? That your history, your voice, your way of moving through the world is something to be corrected, to be scrubbed away like a stain? It is a unique kind of violation, a slow and steady murder of the self. But the tutors were merely the instruments of the cruelty. The true architects of her torment were the masters of the house. Lord Valerius would often observe her lessons, a faint, condescending smirk on his face. He would watch her struggle to hold a fork correctly or to curtsy without, stumbling, and his amusement was a poison that seeped into her bones. He treated her not with overt violence, but with a calculated, chilling indifference that communicated her worthlessness more effectively than any blow. She was his pet project, his wild thing to be tamed, and if the taming proved amusing, so much the better. His cruelty was a slow, patient fire, and he seemed to take a connoisseur's pleasure in watching her spirit slowly burn. If Valerius was the fire, his mother was the ice. Lady Isolde was the matriarch of the Valerius line, a woman carved from winter marble, whose veins seemed to run with frost. She was tall and severe, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the very expression from her face, leaving only a mask of aristocratic disdain. She first summoned Ilara to the Grand Library, a room filled with the scent of old paper and decay. Lady Isolde did not look at Ilara's face. Her gaze fell immediately to Ilara's hands, still faintly stained from years of handling flowers and earth. A look of profound disgust twisted her thin lips. "So this is it," she said, her voice like the crack of a glacier. "The creature my son has dragged in from the gutter. Tell me, child, have you ever held anything in these hands that was not covered in dirt?" The words were not a question. They were a verdict. In that moment, Ilara was not a person, not even an acquisition. She was a contamination. The psychological warfare waged by Lady Isolde was relentless and precise. She would engage Ilara in conversations designed to expose her ignorance, asking her about politics, art, or history, watching with cold satisfaction as Ilara stood in terrified silence, unable to answer. She would critique her every move, from the way she sipped her water to the sound of her breathing. "A Valerius bride does not gulp like a thirsty dog," she would hiss during a silent, agonizing dinner. "She does not stare at her plate as if it might leap up and attack her." Isolde's mission was clear, to make Ilara feel so profoundly out of place, so utterly and irredeemably common, that her spirit would simply give up and die. She was the guardian of the family's purity, and Ilara was the mud threatening to stain its pristine floors. The manor was her kingdom, and in it she was a queen of exquisite silent torture. Ilara's inner world, once a quiet refuge of dreams, became a howling wasteland of fear and self-loathing. The memory of Lyra's words, "Be like the fruit, stay hidden," now felt like a cruel joke. She had been ripped from the earth and there was no soil here to cling to, only cold, polished stone. A terrible conflict raged within her. One part of her, the primal, cornered animal, screamed at her to obey, to become whatever they wanted her to be, because survival was the only thing that mattered. It whispered to her that to fight back was to be broken completely. But another part, a tiny, flickering ember she did not know she possessed, recoiled in horror. It was the part of her that still remembered the scent of flowers, the part that had dreamed of a sunlit room. To surrender to them, this small voice whispered, was a death of a different kind. The culmination of her humiliation came a week after her arrival. Valerius announced he was hosting a small dinner party to introduce her to his closest friends. It was not an introduction, it was an unveiling. She was dressed by a silent maid in a gown of emerald silk so heavy it felt like armor. Her hair twisted into an elaborate style that made her head ache. She was presented to them in the grand dining hall, a room glittering with crystal and silver. Valerius's friends were younger, crueler versions of himself. They looked at her with the same predatory amusement, their eyes raking over her as if she were a prized mare he had just purchased. They did not speak to her, but about her, their voices loud and careless. "Remarkable, Valerius," one of them drawled. "You've certainly polished this little stone. Does she speak?" She was seated at the long polished table, a doll put on display. The food was rich and strange, and she was so terrified of using the wrong piece of silver that she could not bring herself to eat. The conversation flowed around her, a river of gossip, politics, and cruel jokes in which she was a drowning stone. At one point, Valerius, flush with wine, wrapped an arm around her chair, his touch making her skin crawl. "She is a quiet thing," he announced to the table, "but she has her virtues. She is above all obedient." He smiled, a victor's smile, and his friends laughed. In that moment, surrounded by their mocking faces, bathed in the cold light of the chandeliers, Ilara felt a shame so profound it was like a physical illness. She was not a guest at this table. She was the main course in a feast of cruelty. The final killing blow came from Valerius himself. As the night wore on, he grew more boastful. He spoke of his plans for their marriage as if he were discussing a business merger. He never once looked at her as he spoke, his words addressed only to his audience of sneering aristocrats. He was performing his power, and she was his prop. The evening ended with her being dismissed like a servant, sent back to her room while the men remained to drink and laugh. As she walked the long, silent hallway back to her prison, their laughter echoed behind her, each burst of it a stone thrown at her retreating back. She closed the door to her room and leaned against it, her body trembling not with fear, but with a new and terrifying emptiness. The fight was gone. The ember of defiance had been extinguished. She stumbled to the ornate mirror that hung over the fireplace and stared at her own reflection. She saw a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed girl trapped in a rich woman's clothes, her face a mask of hollowed-out despair. Who was this person? The flower girl from the market, the one with dirt under her nails. And a secret dream of painting was gone. She had been murdered in this house, her ghost now forced to wear silk and answer to a new name. The dream of the sunlit room felt like a fantasy from another life, a story about someone else. They had won. They had scraped and scrubbed and polished until there was nothing of the real Ilara left. There was only this empty, beautiful, silent thing they had created. Lying on the vast, cold bed, she felt the full weight of the manor's silence pressed down on her, not as an external force, but as something that had finally broken through and filled her from the inside. There was no escape. There was no hope. The world was exactly as they said it was, a place of masters and things, of predators and prey, and she was prey. The will to resist, the very instinct for self-preservation drained out of her, leaving behind only a vast, cold calm. Perhaps this was the only peace she could ever know, the peace of total surrender. She would become the doll. She would learn her lines, play her part, and maybe if she was quiet and obedient enough, the pain would finally stop. As she closed her eyes, she did not see a future. She saw only an endless expanse of polished floors and locked doors, a silent, gilded eternity in which she was no longer a person, but a beautiful, broken object, finally and completely bought. The end did not come with a scream, but with a quiet, polite announcement. Lord Valerius informed her, with the same detached air he might use to discuss the weather or the purchase of a new horse, that their wedding would take place in 3 days. He did not ask for her opinion. He did not look for her reaction. He was simply stating a fact, a final entry in the ledger of her life. For Ilara, the words were not a shock. The capacity for shock had been burned out of her. It was simply a confirmation, the final formal pronouncement of a death sentence she had been living under since the moment she was thrown into his carriage. The wedding was not to be a union. It was to be the final act of consumption. The last morsel of her identity, her very name, would be swallowed, and she would cease to exist entirely. A strange, hollow calm settled over her. The fight was over. The verdict had been delivered. All that was left was to walk to the gallows. That night, the vast, luxurious room felt more like a tomb than ever before. The silk of her nightgown was cold against her skin, the velvet of the bed covers heavy as a shroud. She stood before the mirror, but the reflection was a stranger's. It was the face of a ghost, pale and still, its eyes two dark, empty windows in a house where no one lived. The girl from the market, the one with earth under her fingernails and a secret dream of sunlight, was a forgotten story. In her place was this polished, silent doll, waiting to be put on the final shelf. She felt a profound and terrifying peace, the peace that comes when all hope has been extinguished. There was no more pain, because there was nothing left to hurt. She had become as cold and as empty as the stone manor itself. She was finally, truly, a possession, and a possession feels nothing. It was in this state of absolute surrender, in the deadest hour of the night, that a sound broke the oppressive silence. It was not the harsh, authoritative turn of a key in the lock that she had come to associate with Valerius. It was a sound so alien to this house that it took her a moment to identify it. A soft, hesitant knock. It was a sound that asked permission, a sound that acknowledged the existence of a person on the other side of the door. Fear, a distant and half-forgotten reflex, flickered in her chest. She remained frozen, silent, hoping whatever it was would go away. But the knock came again, gentle, patient, insistent. Then a faint scratching sound, and the lock turned with a soft, oiled click. The door opened a crack, spilling a sliver of candlelight into the room's oppressive darkness. Standing in the doorway was a figure she barely recognized, a woman who, like Ilara, had perfected the art of being invisible. It was Martha, the elderly head housekeeper. In all the weeks Ilara had been in the manor, she had never heard the woman speak more than a handful of necessary whispered words. Martha was a creature of the shadows, her face a roadmap of silent suffering, her movements efficient and soundless. She was part of the manor's cold machinery, but now she stood in the doorway, her face illuminated by the single candle she held, and for the first time, Ilara saw not a servant but a person. There was an expression in her tired, faded eyes that Ilara had not seen in this house, a fierce, burning pity. Martha slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her, and the tomb of a room was suddenly transformed into a conspirator's chamber. Martha's voice, when she finally spoke, was a dry, rusty whisper, as if it had not been used for anything important in years. She did not waste time with pleasantries or explanations. She looked at the hollowed-out girl before her, and she spoke the words that would shatter the very foundation of Ilara's despair. "He is a fraud," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Lord Valerius, the entire house of Valerius, it is a lie." She explained in short, clipped sentences, the truth that lay festering behind the manor's opulent facade. Valerius was drowning in debt. His arrogance was a shield, his cruelty a distraction. The family's name was the only currency they had left, and it was nearly spent. The marriage was not a whim of a powerful man. It was the desperate final gamble of a bankrupt one. The dowry he expected from the political alliance was not for luxury. It was to keep the wolves from the door, to keep his creditors from tearing down the very stone walls around them. In an instant, the monster was demystified. He was not a god. He was just a man, a pathetic, cornered man, terrified of being exposed. From the folds of her drab grey dress, Martha produced a small, heavy object. As she held it out, a single defiant ray of moonlight broke through a gap in the heavy clouds outside, slicing through the darkness of the room. It glinted off the object in her hand, a flash of impossible light. It was a key, old, iron, and intricate. "This is for the old servant's passage," Martha whispered, pressing it into Ilara's cold, unresisting hand. "It leads from the wine cellar out beyond the eastern wall. He has forgotten it exists. They have all forgotten. The metal was cold and solid, a tangible piece of reality in a world that had become a nightmare. It was more than a key. It was a choice, a future, hope, an emotion so foreign she had forgotten its shape, pierced through the numbness in her chest. It was not a gentle, warming sensation. It was sharp and painful, like the first breath after nearly drowning. Ilara stared at the key in her palm, her mind reeling. The world, which had been a fixed, unchangeable reality of predator and prey, suddenly fractured, revealing 1,000 terrifying new possibilities. To stay meant a certain kind of death, a slow and silent erasure of the soul. But to leave, to flee into the night, a penniless girl with a price on her head, that was a different kind of death, a swift and violent one, perhaps. The manor was a cage, but it was a known cage. The world outside was a wilderness she was no longer equipped to face. The fear of Valerius was a familiar poison, but the fear of the unknown was a paralyzing terror. For the first time since she had been taken, she was no longer just a victim. She was an actor in her own story, and the weight of the decision was suffocating. The path of the root, the path of staying hidden and deep, had led her here. But what good was a root without earth to cling to? And if it were you, standing in that cold, dark room with the key a heavy weight in your hand, what would you do? When the choice is between a familiar gilded cage and a terrifying unknown freedom, which lock do you turn? Would you have the courage to step out into the storm with nothing but a whispered secret and a single key to guide you? Or would the fear of what lies in the darkness be enough to make you stay, to choose the certainty of oppression over the chaos of rebellion? It is a question we all face in our own way, a choice between the prison we know and the terrifying possibility of a world we do not. Your answer defines not just your future, but the very essence of who you are. Martha seemed to sense the storm raging inside Ilara. She pressed a small, heavy pouch of coins into Ilara's other hand. "It is not much," she said, her voice still a whisper, but now laced with an urgency that cut through the fear. "But it will be enough. There is a man, a ferryman named Silas, at the old city docks. Tell him Martha sent you. He will see you across the river, where Valerius's influence is weaker." She gave her a plan, a map out of the labyrinth. The wedding night, she explained, would be the perfect time. The guards would be distracted, the house in a state of controlled chaos. It was the moment of Valerius's greatest triumph, the perfect cover for his greatest humiliation. Then, as quietly as she had appeared, Martha was gone, leaving only the key, the coins, and the deafening roar of a choice to be made. Ilara stood alone in the center of the room, the moonlight now streaming in through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, frantic stars. The peace of surrender was gone, replaced by a terrifying electric energy. She was no longer a ghost. She was a girl holding a key. The future was no longer a straight, dark line leading to an altar. It was a crossroads shrouded in fog. She did not know if she would choose escape, a desperate flight into the unknown. Nor did she know if some other, more dangerous idea was taking root in the barren soil of her mind. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not be walking to an execution. She would be walking into a reckoning, and the wedding night, now just 2 days away, would be the most decisive night of her life. The wedding night descended upon the Valerius manor not as a celebration but as a final suffocating blanket of silence. The grand hall, a place designed for joy, was instead a theater of exquisite tension, its air thick with the scent of wilting lilies and unspoken cruelties. Hundreds of candles burned in their silver sconces, but their light seemed only to deepen the shadows, catching the cold glint of jewels on the throats of women and the harder glint of calculation in the eyes of men. This was Ethelberg's elite, a congregation of predators dressed in silk and velvet, their smiles as sharp and polished as their knives. They had come not to witness a union, but to affirm a power dynamic, to feast on the spectacle of a rich man claiming his latest, most exotic prize. At the head of the hall, before a grim-faced officiant, stood Ilara. She was a vision of impossible beauty, encased in a wedding gown of ivory silk so heavy and ornate it felt less like a dress and more like a beautiful diamond-studded coffin. Her hair was a crown of intricate braids, her face a pale, perfect mask of compliance. But beneath the placid surface, a hurricane raged. The hollow, surrendered doll of the previous days was gone, replaced by a girl vibrating. With a terror so profound, It had looped back on itself and become a strange, cold strength. In a small hidden pocket sewn into the gown's voluminous skirt, her fingers were wrapped around the hard, unyielding shape of an iron key. It was a secret anchor in a sea of lies, a single solid truth in a world that had become an illusion. Beside her, Lord Valerius was the very picture of smug triumph. He stood taller, his chest puffed out with the pride of a conqueror. He saw the crowd. He saw their envy. He saw the confirmation of his own grand narrative. He did not, however, see the woman beside him. He saw only the reflection of his own victory in the pale, beautiful mirror he had purchased. He was a man on the precipice of securing his legacy, of pulling his crumbling house back from the brink of ruin, and the sheer force of his arrogance blinded him to the silent, seismic shift that was happening just inches away from him. He believed he had broken her. He believed he had scraped away her soul and replaced it with an obedient void. He had never been more wrong. The officiant, a man whose face was as dry and brittle as old parchment, began to speak. His voice droned on, a meaningless litany of words about union and fidelity that echoed unnaturally in the cavernous hall. Each word was a hammer blow against Ilara's resolve, a tick of the clock counting down to the end of her life. She could feel the key, its cold edges pressing into her palm. The plan was simple, a frantic whisper from Martha, in the moments before she was led to the hall. When the vows were done, when the crowd was distracted by wine and music, she was to slip away. The key, the passage, the ferryman's Silas, freedom. It was a tangible, terrifying possibility, a door standing open at the end of a long, dark corridor. All she had to do was walk through it. But as the officiant's words washed over her, a different voice began to rise from the depths of her soul. It was a voice she had never heard before, quiet but insistent, and it spoke not of escape but of justice. To flee would be to survive, yes. She would save her own skin, but the lie would remain. Valerius would be momentarily embarrassed, but he would recover. He would invent a story, find another girl, another solution. The world would not change. The great grinding machine of cruelty and injustice would roll on, and she would have done nothing but save one of its countless victims. The faces of the other vendors in the market flashed in her mind, the weary mothers, the hopeful children, the men with broken spirits. To run was to leave them all behind. To run was to confirm that the powerful were and always would be untouchable. Do you, Ilara of Ethelberg, take this man, Lord Valerius, to be your lawfully wedded husband? The question fell into the hall, and with it, a profound, expectant silence. Every eye was on her. This was the moment. The script had been written, her line delivered to her. All she had to do was say, "I do," and the performance would be complete. Valerius turned to her, a possessive, confident smile on his lips. He was not waiting for an answer. He was waiting for the final click of a lock he believed he had already closed. Time seemed to stretch, to become thick and viscous. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the cathedral of silence. She could feel the key. She could picture the dark passage, the smell of the river, the freedom of the night. It was so close. But then she looked past Valerius, past the impassive face of the officiant, and she looked at them, the crowd, the silent, complicit witnesses to her degradation. She saw their smug faces, their bored expressions, their utter, unshakable belief in the world as it was. And in that moment the fear did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by something far greater, a white-hot, righteous rage. She drew a breath. It was the first breath she had truly taken in weeks, a deep, shuddering gasp that seemed to pull strength from the very air around her. She lifted her chin, and for the first time she met the gaze of the crowd head-on. Her lips parted. Valerius's smile widened, anticipating his victory. And then she spoke the word that would bring his world crashing down. It was not loud. It was a whisper, a mere breath of sound, but it sliced through the hall's silence like a shard of glass. "No!" The word hung in the air, electric and impossible. A collective, confused murmur rippled. Through the crowd, Valerius's smile froze on his face, a grotesque mask of disbelief. He leaned closer, his voice a furious hiss meant only for her. "What did you say?" He thought he had misheard. He thought it was a moment of bridal nerves, a peasant girl's foolish hesitation. He was still the master of this universe, and his reality did not allow for such a word to exist. Ilara did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the sea of stunned faces before her. She took another breath, and, this time when she spoke, Her voice was clear, steady, and loud enough for every soul in that hall to hear. "No," she repeated. "I will not." She turned then, not to Valerius, but to face the assembly directly. She was no longer a bride at an altar. She was a witness on a stand, and this was her testimony. The fear was still there, a cold snake coiling in her stomach, but her voice did not tremble. It was the voice of a person who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to lose. "You have all come here tonight to witness a marriage," she began, her voice ringing with a power she never knew she possessed. "But this is not a marriage. It is a business transaction. It is a lie." Valerius's face had transformed, the disbelief curdling into a dark, murderous rage. He reached for her arm, but she stepped away, a small, simple movement that was the most profound act of defiance in her entire life. She was claiming her own space. "This man," she continued, and she pointed, a single trembling finger at the nobleman, who now stood frozen in a state of sputtering fury. "This Lord Valerius does not seek a wife. He seeks a lifeline." Her gaze swept across the front rows, where the city's most powerful merchants and bankers sat. "He stands before you tonight not as a powerful lord, but as a bankrupt fraud. His coffers are empty. His name is worthless. He is drowning in debts owed to many of you sitting in this very room." A gasp went through the crowd. This was not just an insult. It was a sacrilege. It was a tearing of the sacred veil of wealth and power that held their entire society together. The creditors she had alluded to shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting from Ilara to Valerius, the polite masks of their faces beginning to crack. They had suspected, they had heard rumors, but to have it declared so publicly by the bride at the altar was a catastrophe. "He did not court me." Ilara's voice rose, filled with the pain of 1,000 humiliations. "He bought me. He bought me in the market square like a piece of livestock for a purse of gold he likely had to borrow." She looked directly at Lady Isolde, whose face had become a mask of pure, horrified fury. "He brought me to his house and tried to scrub the dirt from my hands, but he could not scrub the truth from his ledger books. This wedding, this alliance you all came to witness, is his final, desperate gamble to buy a solution to his own ruin." The spell was broken. The silent, ordered theatre of the wedding erupted into chaos. Shouts and accusations flew across the hall. The creditors, their worst fears confirmed, were on their feet, their voices rising in a panicked chorus. Valerius, his face purple with rage, finally broke free from his paralysis. The veneer of the aristocrat was gone, burned away to reveal the cornered, rabid animal beneath. With a roar of pure hatred, he lunged for her. "You lying gutter witch!" he screamed, his hands outstretched like claws, his intention not just to silence her, but to kill her. In that heart-stopping moment, Ilara stood her ground. She saw death in his eyes, and she did not flinch. She had spoken her truth, and if this was the price, she would pay it. But before his hands could find her throat, a figure stepped between them. It was not a guard or a nobleman. It was one of the very creditors Valerius had been trying to deceive, a burly merchant with a face like a bulldog and eyes that had seen 1,000 bad deals. "That's enough, Valerius," the man growled, his hand clamping down on Valerius's shoulder like a vice. "I think the lady has something to say that we all need to hear." The dam of aristocratic decorum burst completely. The hall devolved into a shouting, shoving mob. Valerius, restrained by the merchant, thrashed and cursed like a madman, his ruin now absolute and public. Lady Isolde, the marble matriarch, stood frozen amidst the chaos, her face a canvas of utter devastation. Her life's work, the preservation of the family's name, had been incinerated in a matter of minutes by a girl from the gutter. Her icy composure finally shattered, and she looked, for the first time, like what she was, a terrified old woman in a house of cards. Amidst the pandemonium, a firm, familiar hand grasped Ilara's arm. It was Martha. Her face was grim, but her eyes shone with a fierce, triumphant pride. "Now," she whispered, her voice cutting through the din. "It is time to go now." She pulled Ilara away from the altar, away from the screaming and the chaos. No one noticed them leave. All eyes were on the spectacular implosion of the House of Valerius. They were invisible once more, but this was a new kind of invisibility. It was not the invisibility of the victim, but the invisibility of the victor, slipping away from the battlefield after the war had been won. Martha led her through a tapestry-covered door, down a winding set of servants' stairs, into the cold, damp dark of the wine cellar. The air smelled of dust, sour wine, and freedom. With a strength that belied her age, Martha pulled a heavy crate away from a wall, revealing a small, iron-banded door that Ilara would never have seen. She produced her own key, and with a groan of rusted metal the lock turned. The door swung open, revealing not a passage, but a black, star-dusted sky and the clean, cold scent of the night. They did not speak as they hurried across the neglected gardens, keeping to the shadows of the high stone walls. The sounds of the chaos in the manor faded behind them, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the sound of their own frantic breathing. They reached the outer gate, the one Martha's key was for, and with another grating turn, they were out. They were standing on a quiet, cobbled lane on the edge of the city, the Valerius estate a dark, monstrous silhouette against the moon. Ilara took a deep breath of the free air, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime it did not hurt to breathe. Her victory was not a story that would be told in the history books. It was a quiet, personal, and profound reclamation. The fall of the House of Valerius was swift and brutal. The creditors descended like a pack of wolves, stripping the manor of its treasures, picking its bones clean. Lord Valerius, disgraced and penniless, disappeared into the city's underbelly, a ghost haunted by the memory of his own public execution. Lady Isolde was forced to take residence in a small charity-run home for impoverished gentlewomen, a fate she would have once considered worse than death, forced to live out her days surrounded by the very thing she despised, failure. Ilara and Martha made their way to the docks, where the ferryman Silas, a man with kind eyes and a silent understanding, took them across the dark, churning river without a question. They left the city of Ethelberg behind, a place of ghosts and nightmares, and did not look back. Martha, free from her decades of servitude, seemed to shed years with every mile they traveled, a quiet smile finally returning to her tired face. Justice, Ilara learned, was not always a grand pronouncement from a judge. Sometimes it was the quiet click of a lock turning for the last time. Sometimes it was simply the freedom to walk away. And how many times does life put us in a cage of others' expectations, of society's judgments, of our own fears? We are handed a script, told who we are supposed to be, what we are supposed to want, and for so long we might play the part, believing the cage is the only reality that exists. But for all of us, there is the potential for a turning point, a moment when we are handed a key, a secret truth, a whispered encouragement, a sudden blinding realization that the bars of the cage are not as strong as we thought. The question is never whether the key will be offered. The question is whether we will have the courage to take it and to turn it. Months later, far from the cold stone heart of Ethelberg, a different story was being written. It was not a story of lords and ladies, but of light and color. In a small town by the sea, where the air smelled of salt and possibility, there was a small, simple room. It was not grand or opulent, but it had a single large window that faced the morning sun, and the light that poured through it was warm and golden and real. The room smelled not of lemon polish or decay, but of linseed oil, turpentine, and the fresh, clean scent of stretched canvas. Here a young woman stood before an easel. Her hands, once stained with the bruised purple of dying petals, were now smudged with the vibrant, joyful colors of creation: cerulean blue, cadmium yellow, and a deep, defiant crimson. Her hair was not in a painful crown of braids, but fell loosely over her shoulders. Her face was no longer a mask of fear or hollow compliance. It was a face at peace, her eyes focused, her expression one of quiet, profound concentration. She was not the flower girl. She was not the unbought woman. She was simply Ilara. On the easel was a painting, nearly complete. It was a riot of color, a celebration of life. It depicted a field of wildflowers, not the cultivated, perfect blooms of a nobleman's garden, but the tough, resilient, beautiful weeds that pushed their way through cracks in the stone to reach the sun. They were vibrant, chaotic, and unapologetically alive. She was not just capturing their beauty. She was honoring their spirit. She was preserving not their fleeting life, but their eternal resilience. She had found her sunlit room, not in the world, but within herself. Her suffering had not been erased, but it had been redeemed. It had become the dark, fertile soil from which this new life had grown. She had learned that true worth is not a price tag tossed at your feet in the mud. It is not something that can be given or taken away by the powerful. True worth is forged in the silent, terrifying moment when you are given a choice between a familiar cage and an unknown freedom, and you choose to turn the key. It is the quiet, unshakable power that comes from looking the world in the eye and, with a voice that is entirely your own, finally saying no. If this story of a woman who found her voice in the deepest silence has spoken to you, if you have ever felt trapped by a judgment you did not deserve or a life you did not choose, then share a piece of that feeling with us. Let the world know that these silent battles are fought and won every day. Write in the comments below, I have also had a turning point, because every time one of us finds the courage to speak our truth, we make the world a little wider, a little brighter, and a little more free for the next person who needs to find their voice.